It appears that Trump got another couple wins at the Supreme Court, but as I've explained to you before, whenever there's a court decision of any kind, Supreme, lower courts, and you get up and you look at your phone and you see this decision, don't write it in concrete just yet. Okay, take it all with a grain of salt. There are decisions that get way deeper than the headlines, that go back and forth. Don't ever get too excited, and don't ever go jump off a bridge when there's a decision you love or a decision you hate. We have to work through these things by talking to smart people. That's why we bring Josh Hammer on the show, host of the Josh Hammer Show. Okay, Josh, I see headlines, and it looks like Trump got a couple nice wins, including allowing ICE agents to keep arresting people. Focus on that. What's the backstory? What happened?
Yeah, so Jesse, in this case, I think the headline matches the reality is that these are a couple of nice wins for the Trump administration. So first, there is this immigration enforcement case that comes out of Los Angeles, one of America's most infamous so-called sanctuary cities. And they basically say that the Trump administration is correctly enforcing immigration law when they are sending in ICE agents to engage in so-called raids, AKA trying to deport illegal aliens, people who should not be here illegally, which last I checked is in line with the mandate that President Trump got at the ballot box last November. This is exactly what people voted for. And there's a very interesting concurring opinion from Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who basically says, you know what? There are some administrations that go very light on enforcing immigration law. I don't know, maybe the Barack Obama administration or the Joe Biden administration. And then there are some administrations that are a bit tougher on enforcing immigration law. That would be the Trump administration. And what Brett Kavanaugh, I think, very correctly and astutely says is that, you know what? It's not up to us. It's not up to us as judges to make these policy determinations as to just how rigorous immigration law ought to be enforced. That is a political decision for the voters, for the American people. I actually would frankly go, Jesse, a little further than that. There's an interesting clause in Article 2 of the Constitution called the take care clause. It basically says that the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. I have long interpreted, going back to my law school days, I have long interpreted the take care clause to mean that the president does have an obligation to, in his best efforts, to enforce all the laws. Now, this gets a little tricky because there is such thing as prosecutorial discretion. You simply cannot prosecute every single crime in the country. There's literally not enough money or manpower. Fine, that's a reality in every prosecution office there. But you can't just let some laws just nakedly go unenforced. That's how you get Barack Obama's DACA and DAPA amnesties back from 10 to 12 years ago or so there. So anyway, it's a good opinion there. It's a very nice win when it comes to immigration enforcement. It's a solid win for the administration.
Okay, surprise, surprise, Sotomayor was unhappy with this whole thing. I find the mind of the communists to be fascinating. What exactly is her worldview on all this?
Okay, so if you go into the Supreme Court and really the federal courts more generally, if you look at what they've said when it comes to how the presidency can go about enforcing immigration law, first of all, Jesse, I should probably note, I kind of object to this on a level of principle. I do not think that the courts should be engaged in this level of nitpicking as to how the executive branch, how ICE, how DHS goes about enforcing immigration laws. Judges should stick to judging there and let the political branches do what they do. Nonetheless, the courts have weighed in a lot over the years when it comes to how immigration law can be enforced. And what they basically say is that they have the ability to go into certain workplaces, focus on certain industries where there are disproportionately going to be folks who are not here legally, whether that is landscaping or construction or agriculture, things like that. And furthermore, they also say that it is okay to focus disproportionately on areas where there is not a lot of English being spoken. What they also say is that it is illegal, it's unconstitutional to explicitly racially profile. So they draw the line somewhere between a preponderance of people not speaking English on the one hand, which they say is okay. You can have ICE agents focus there. On the other hand, they say that if you're just picking out basically a bunch of brown people, then it's not okay to focus there. So look, if we're trying to be charitable, which I don't really want to be to Sonia Sotomayor, but if we're trying to be charitable, that's what she's saying. She's basically saying that the Trump administration, ICE, is focusing not just on all the factors that I said that you're allowed to focus on, but they're actually focusing really just on brown people. Again, I don't buy this for a second, to be honest with you. I think it's ludicrous, frankly, that the courts are involved in this kind of process in the first place. But that's in theory, Jesse. If we're trying to steel man the argument, so if you're trying to give the best impression of our argument, that's in theory what she's trying to say. But really, she's just a communist, as you said.
Josh, what does this mean as far as ICE in places like Chicago? Obviously, Chicago's been all over the news. We're sending in the National Guard. Does this mean the Trump administration can move forward sending ICE anywhere they please? Or are there little limitations in this ruling like there always seem to be?
Look, I mean, lawyers like to lawyer, Jesse. So there's always going to be some kind of legally, lawyerly limits there. I mean, yes, but also only to a point. I mean, this does, I think, pave the way nicely for the Trump administration to start deploying ICE, DHS. But the National Guard is a slightly different legal analysis, but potentially also even the National Guard. Speaking of Los Angeles, let's not forget that the National Guard was just in Los Angeles in June. There wasn't a specifically deportation-oriented mission back then. It was really just trying to quell anarchy, but the anarchy was immigration-related, so it's kind of all related to one another. But yeah, Chicago is very much in the crosshairs. Just over the past 24 hours, it looks like Operation Midway Blitz has started, which is an immigration enforcement operation centered around Brandon Johnson's city of Chicago, perhaps all throughout J.B. Pritzker's state of Illinois. Look, Jesse, as a former Chicagoan myself, who has been very sad to see that city go tremendously downhill over the past decade, and it was already pretty bad, frankly, when I was living there. It's gone a heck of a lot more downhill since then. I say all hands on deck. If Donald Trump wants to clean up Chicago, I say 2 big fat thumbs up. There's a long way to go. It is a serious challenge, but it's a world-class city that should be made great once again, I think.
Okay, let's focus on the other one. Donald Trump removing a Democrat member of the Federal Trade Commission. How in the world did this even end up on the Supreme Court? What happened?
So the FTC is one of these quasi-independent agencies there where you have Congress that statutorily legislates, where there has to be a certain partisan mix of Republican commissioners, Democrat commissioners. Basically, it is structured differently. The FTC, the FCC, the National Labor Relations Board. There's a lot of these agencies that really kind of go back to the early part of the 20th century, especially the FDR era, the New Deal. A lot of these agencies are structured differently as a constitutional and statutory matter from kind of the big iconic agencies that people are familiar with, call it the DOJ, Treasury, so forth there. Now, the big legal fight that's going on here is what is the extent of the president's executive power to engage in removal decisions, to actually engage in hiring and firing personnel decisions, that is, when it comes to all agencies, whether they call themselves independent or not, within Article 2 of the Constitution. My very simple, straightforward legal analysis, I've been saying this for 20 years now, I guess, is that the executive power of Article 2, if it means literally anything whatsoever, it means the ability to control who is in your executive branch. That, after all, is what defines you as the chief executive of the executive branch. So unless you are responsible for all hiring and firing decisions, you are not actually the executive wielding the executive power as Article 2, Section 1, Clause 1 calls for. Now, the alternative argument, which is essentially an FDR New Deal Democrat argument, is that no, Congress can actually legislate certain limits on the president's removal power there. All this is teeing up potentially a direct challenge to a very problematic case from the very height of the New Deal, a 1935 case called Humphrey's Executor, which was one of the more infamous decisions of that era, where they basically said that congressional limitations on the president's removal power for these independent agencies is actually okay. It actually is constitutional. There's been a lot of chipping away at that, including a National Labor Relations Board case earlier this term called Gwynne versus Wilcox, which is another win for Trump. Very similar context there, firing a Biden-nominated member, Gwynne Wilcox, of the NLRB. So between NLRB and Wilcox, and now the FTC in this particular case, I think we're kind of gearing up for a direct challenge to this case, Humphrey's Executor, and I say, frankly, it's long overdue.
All right, let's shift gears and talk about trade, specifically tariff refunds. And here was Scott Bessent.
If the Supreme Court rules against you on these tariffs, is the administration prepared to offer rebates?
So, Kristen, I am confident that we will win at the Supreme Court, but there are numerous other avenues that we can take. They diminish President Trump's negotiating position, but there are numerous in terms of, and remember, this isn't about the dollars, this is about balance. The dollars are an after amount.
Would you offer rebates, though? Are you prepared to offer rebates?
So we would have to give a refund on about half the tariffs, which would be terrible for the Treasury.
And you're prepared to give those refunds?
Well, I mean, there's no be prepared. If the court says it, we'd have to.
Josh, what?
Jesse, look, I wish I could say that I share Scott Bessent's confidence when it comes to the Supreme Court outcome. I don't. I'm not predicting a loss, but I'm not predicting a win either. I genuinely actually am not sure which way this one is going to go. If you look at the legal ruling from the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, which was the court that had the Court of Appeals ruling just about a week or two ago, whenever it was, they wrote it in very kind of formalistic, legalistic, we might even call it a quasi-originalist form of analysis there, clearly trying to appeal to Brett Kavanaugh, to Amy Coney Barrett, John Roberts, to the court's swing justice. Which way they will ultimately decide, I don't actually know. I mean, the ultimate legal question here is the balance of trade, or America's gargantuan trade deficit year in and year out, the kind of quote-unquote emergency that would allow the president to invoke this sort of emergency authority there? I think it's a very interesting question. I see both sides' argument. I don't actually have a super strong stance on the matter. I'm inclined to think that the administration is probably correct there. I think Congress likely intended to delegate a lot of this to the executive branch there, but it's a very interesting, close legal argument. The easiest way to get this done, though, just to clarify, is for Congress to just pass a law. That is obviously the way that this should be done. Tariffs, raising revenue. Congress is the perfect body for that. Unfortunately, Jesse, as you and I both know, Congress is not good for a whole lot these days other than naming post offices and a bunch of cable news grandstand.
Oh, it's so friggin' true. Josh, thank you, brother. Kometsu. I would thank you for coming to my YouTube channel, but I know how brilliant it is, and I know you love it here. So subscribe and watch. We're going to start really ramping things up and putting some funny stuff, some interesting stuff out there, some collaborations. Either way, my YouTube channel is officially the place to be. So stick around.